Welcome to Ignite Intimacy, a podcast exploring intimacy, romantic relationships, sexuality, and everything that relates to these hot topics. We're going in. Are you ready? This is your host, Laura Aisha. Let's do this. Hello, Ignite Intimacy community. This is your host, Miss Laura Aisha, and it is so great to be with you again. We're actually just coming off of a nice 2-week summer holiday. I was at Burning Man, which was amazing. My first burn, and yeah, it felt like home. It felt like the first time I went to a Grateful Dead show in '92, and I was like, oh, this feels like familiar to me, familiar territory, and like my tribe. So it was really, really amazing. And if you don't know about Burning Man, just Google it and you'll find all sorts of amazing things, or go to burningman.org. So I'm really grateful to be here on the line with a powerful woman who's been on a powerful journey. And we're going to be bringing a new conversation to Ignite Intimacy. We really haven't touched on this topic much at all. So that's exciting and energizing to me. And also a dear friend connected me with our guest today. So it's exciting when your friends say, hey, I know someone who'd be perfect for your podcast. And then it all lines up. So I would like to introduce everyone to Linda Kay Klein, who is on the line with us today. How's it going, Linda?
It's going great. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, so Linda has a brand new baby in the world. We're talking largely today about Linda's new book that literally just launched on September 4th called Pure. And it is pure inside the evangelical movement that shamed a generation of young women and how I broke free. So the book is Pure. It was released on September 4th. Congratulations, Linda Kay. That's an amazing accomplishment.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, and it's been like over a decade of research that you've been doing around the evangelical movement and purity that really fed the pages of this book, right?
That's exactly right. Both a combination of, over a decade of research for this kind of report on abstinence culture in evangelical churches, and also a much longer story, which is my personal experience of having grown up in the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is like a lifelong journey for you. And so for our audience today, this is what we're diving into. We're talking about, in particular, Linda's book, Pure, the evangelical movement, purity, sexual shaming through religion, and, what type of culture that creates. And then what are the impacts over time on young women, young men, as they grow into adulthood, having grown up in environments where there is a heightened sense of shame around sex and sexuality. Because, I would say that shame and sexuality kind of seem to be intertwined, right?
Sadly.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely.
And I actually don't know where that actually started. Do you have any insight into that, Linda?
Yeah, I think it goes, at least one root is Greco-Roman culture, actually. So you have Plato and Aristotle talking about how the earthly plane is not as important or not as valuable as the intellectual plane, the sort of spiritual, intellectual world that we live in when we rise above our earthly selves. So I think in many ways, kind of this disconnection that we experience from our body, which includes our sexuality, and, sort of this judgment of our bodies and of our sexuality can root all the way back there. And, and those teachings were very influential to early Christian thinkers, particularly our most influential early Christian thinkers in many cases. So it's really deeply embedded into Christian culture, which is, of course, a huge presence in American culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and growing up in a Roman Catholic household, there was just, the extent of our birds and bees conversation was, you don't have sex until you're married.
Right.
And I don't know if they, my parents thought they were doing us a favor by like that being the extent of the conversation. It's certainly not what happened.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because, that teaching, which is very similar to the teaching that I was raised with, though a more intensified version of it, it's fascinating because that's most people's sexuality education. The sexuality education is don't do it. It reminds me of one of my interviewees who told me that she read an entire book, an evangelical Christian book on masturbation. And she read it and she was like, she finished it. And then she said, okay, so I have it very clear that masturbation is wrong. So what exactly is masturbation? Because we talk ad nauseum about how dangerous sex is, particularly outside of marriage, but we don't talk about sex. So even that message around, don't do it, it's almost comical that we consider that sexuality education, because ultimately we're not talking about sex, we're talking about who you're supposed to be, who you're expected to be, and who you will be or who others will think you are if you don't meet these expectations.
Well, and I think about the pressure of young women around the globe and how precious their virginity is. And if you are abused in some way, or you have sex before you are arranged to be married to someone, or you are raped when you're younger and you no longer have the purity of your virginity, you can be completely ostracized from your family, your community, sold off to sexual slavery. It's pretty broad and impactful what can happen to a young woman around her virginity. And if she no longer has that as like a tool or a bartering, tool or a way to sell herself into potentially a quote unquote better life.
Yeah. Yeah, you're so right. It's just heartbreaking. And and ultimately, the sexual ethic that we have in this culture, is essentially a very similar sexual ethic. We have a different relationship to it. We have a different intensity around it. But, having grown up in purity culture in this community, I really learned that there are two types of girls and women, those who are pure and those who are impure. And ultimately, we were defined as in our totality, as pure, impure, or wife material, or lucky if any good Christian man ever loves you, or, any number of things on the binary that have to do with your worth in this community. We were defined based on one thing about us, and that is other people's perception of our sexuality. So ultimately I would say that, we have a different relationship to that ethic, and that, fortunately, many people aren't having their lives threatened because of being deemed impure. And yet, at the same time, many of the people that I've spoken with who were raised in purity culture in particular, really felt that a version of their life was at threat. Because if they were deemed impure, if they were deemed no longer wife material within a community in which your highest good is being a good and supportive wife and mother, and to help your family become closer to God, and that's really your role, not being able to fulfill that role can feel like you have no place in the community. And if you have no place in the community, that can make you feel like you have no place with God. Because for a lot of people, the community is, what they perceive as their access point to God.
That is so powerful. And it's like, and what I hear is like, no place in the world.
Yeah, exactly. Well, when that is your whole world, and when you're taught that everything outside of that world is to be not untrusted, because that binary that I was talking about, that pure, impure binary, it fits very neatly into a much larger binary that we learn about in evangelical culture, and that I think, sadly permeates our entire culture. It's this good, bad, in, out, right, wrong. If you're in this camp, you're pure and you're holy and you're good and you're worthy and you are wise. And if you're in this camp, then you are impure and you are unholy and you are ugly and hated and hurt. And so anyway, so we tend to look at the world through this binary, and I certainly was raised looking at the world in this binary. So if you don't fit into the good side, then where does that leave you when that's what you're taught, that all there is?
Yeah, I know. And it's like I'm sitting here, there's like a question forming within me around this. It's like, okay, so there's like the good, the like that's what you aspire to be. You aspire to fulfill God's role for you as a woman, and that highest role of being, a good wife and a good mother, and all of those things. And it's like, but what about the other side of that? Like, what is left there
Mm, mm.
aside from the
Yeah,
obvious, right? Trauma
yeah,
and shame and not knowing where your place is in the world, or who you are.
right. Yeah, I mean it's very traumatic. So as you mentioned, I've been doing this is a report in many ways, because I've been doing research for a long time. So the core amount of my research has been I spent the last 12 years interviewing people who are raised in white American evangelical churches like my own as girls, and talking to them about the impacts on their lives. And a number of the people who I've talked to are still within the evangelical church, and yet a number of them have left the church. And what I've heard, is that leaving the church is incredibly painful for people.
Mm.
To your point, you are best case scenario, left feeling lost oftentimes, feeling like, who am I? I spent my whole life, with my identity being tied to this community, this people, this faith, this purpose, and
Yeah.
now I am directionless, floating, and so that's sort of best case scenario. And then worst case scenario, you can believe the lie that that outside the community is that space is reserved for the evil, the bad, the sinful, the horrors.
Mm, mm.
And you can categorize yourself in those ways and begin to say, yeah, I am just a horrible person, that's just who I am. And even as much as you're claiming it, you're reiterating the shaming, and it's a real struggle. I actually refer to it as the gap, because I find that when people leave a totalizing worldview, which, evangelicalism, for many people is a totalizing worldview,
Mm.
when they leave a totalizing worldview, there's a period where your body has really been trained by that worldview to behave to a certain set of, life experiences in a certain way. And then you go into another world and your spirit and your mind, begin to change, and you begin to say, for example, in my case, sexuality and spirituality are not mutually exclusive. And so I want to embrace my sexual self as part of my whole humanity, my spirit and my mind and my body as one entity. And yet, the body is still on the other side of the gap. The body, with its neural pathways that have been trained in shame around sexuality in
Mm.
particular, is in a totally different place. So for me, one of the things that happened is when I left the community, in large part because I was rejecting the sexual shaming, I thought I would be free. I thought all of a sudden I'm going to be able to no longer have to struggle with sexual shame because I'm not in the community where the shamers, live.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but I quickly learned that I had internalized so much of the shame that I had learned growing up, and that now it lived inside of me, and I was more capable of shaming myself than I would have liked
Mm.
to admit.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but there's just so much shame around sexuality in general that
Indeed.
then you've got your experience and what you're carrying with you, and then you're coming out of a very tight insular community into the greater world, and then your shame is interacting with other people's shame, and their shame is for maybe different comes from different places than your
Yes.
shame came from, so then like all
Yes.
of a sudden you've got like, and that's one of the things that we're out to create a new story around, a healing around, a coming to terms with, is that there is no shame, like pulling apart, like uncollapsing shame and sexuality. It's like sexuality exists. It's one of the most beautiful, powerful, amazing things that exists in the world. It's everywhere. It
Yes.
like permeates the experience of being a human being on planet Earth. And so the more that we have, a revolution in sex education, in knowing ourselves, in loving ourselves fully and wholly, in understanding ourselves as sexual beings, and that like that is okay, that we have this force running through us that is a part of our experience here on planet Earth as humans. And then how do we define our own relationship to that from a place of wholeness and self-love and self-care, which means then we can love and care for others in that way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, you're making me think a little bit about sort of the research around shame. There's some interesting research that I'm sure many of your listeners are very familiar with shame research, partially because of Brene Brown having, repopularized it. But, shame is this feeling I am something bad, or people will think I am something bad, as opposed to, say, guilt, which is this feeling I did something bad. And there's something about, feeling like you are bad, which, becomes more likely if you're told you are bad over and over and over again, as you are in a purity culture where you're defined, as good or bad, pure or impure. But anyway, there's something about feeling that you are bad, or that people think that you are bad, that actually makes you disconnect from other people. You have this fear of being rejected by other people because they're going to see you as bad. So, it leads people to sometimes, hide things about themselves that they feel that other people, will shame them for, or will think that they're bad because of, or to, beat themselves up and in this sort of inward focused way, I'm so bad, I'm so horrible, which ultimately keeps us from connecting with others, or to lash out at others to keep them far away, or really just, isolate yourself, particularly around the things that you're shamed around, and disappear, when you feel that you're afraid. So, so what it does is it actually creates disconnection. And to your point around, how we need to actually do the work to get through the shame that we experience individually so that we can connect with others, that aligns perfectly with the research, because so long as we're steeped in shame around this, it is going to be working against us when we try to connect with others, particularly around the thing around which we have shame, which for many of us, is our sexuality.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's so interesting. I'm thinking about a couple of different things here. And one is just the shame that, I couldn't really even say the word masturbation until, I don't know, my late 20s or early 30s. It just was oh my God, that word. And then what, and I've always been a sexual explorer. I have been connected to my own pleasure systems since a young age. But it always felt like something I had to hide. And I don't know where I got that I had to hide it from, but it was ingrained in me that this is something I have to hide. And so, thinking about that, and then something that's, going into your story a bit, I'd love for you to share a little bit more about your experience being in your family as a young woman and, within this purity culture, and what that was like for you, because I think about some of the things that you've shared about the fears, the actual physical impact of the stress on your body, and also this fear of being pregnant, almost this obsessive, pregnant, doing these pregnancy tests to just make sure you weren't pregnant, even though you hadn't been had sex yet.
Yeah, so one of the things that I experienced in addition to, I use the word shame a lot, but really the way that shame manifests for me, the way that I felt it in my body, it wasn't bashfulness or shyness, which are words that people sometimes associate with shame, right? It was anxiety. And it was fear, that's how the shame felt in my body. So, I was talking about how when I first left evangelicalism and rejected the sexual shaming that I'd been raised with, how I thought that I was going to be, completely free of sexual shame now, and I remember I was in my early 20s and I went to my long-term boyfriend and, who I loved. And I said, I'm ready to have sex. I want to be able to share this with you. And I felt completely, healthy in that decision. And yet, when we would, get anywhere near it, I would have what he called freakouts. So a freakout was, I would break down into tears. My eczema that comes out when I get stressed would come out, and I'd be scratching myself until I bled, and I would end up just in a ball in the corner of the bed, in a very unsexy way that made sex, impossible.
Yeah.
And then I would be newly ashamed after that, because now not only was I ashamed of my sexuality, but now I was also ashamed of having had a freak out, which nobody who knew that this was happening, there weren't a lot of people who knew, but nobody who knew that this was happening was like, actually, that's completely normal,
Yeah.
I feel like I was completely insane.
Yeah.
And then of course I would, still, even after an episode happened, I would still be filled with fear and anxiety. And one of the things that I would be most anxious about was that I had been raised that horrible things happen to girls and women when we go too far sexually. And, it wasn't ever clear what too far meant when you lose your impurity, because that was defined by the community. There were no hard and fast. So I felt myself impure, and I felt myself waiting for punishment.
Wow.
And the way in which I felt most afraid that I would be punished, because it would be exposing my sin to my community, though I had left them, I was still very cognizant of their approval, was that I would become pregnant, And so even though, there was no chance, from a biological point of view that I would become pregnant, I would walk down to the local drugstore and I would take a pregnancy test, and I would then be able to breathe afterward and know that I was safe. And, and this happened over and over again, and it made me feel completely broken. And like I would never be healthy or have a healthy relationship. And it really wasn't until I started to call up some of my girlfriends from back home in the Evangelical Church that I've been raised in, and started to talk to them about what I was experiencing.
Yeah.
I started to realize that I wasn't alone, because, then I would sit with my jaw just dropped to the ground as they told me very similar stories from their own lives. Though some had stayed, some had left, some were married, some were single, some had waited to have sex until marriage, some, had decidedly not. Some had waited to have their first kiss at the altar. And yet so many of us were experiencing sexual shame, fear, and anxiety that was oftentimes manifesting physically in ways that actually mimicked the symptoms of PTSD.
Wow. Yeah, I could see that completely. Well, and then there's this other side of it where, so with regards to the boys and the men in the community, was there additional pressure on the females to act a certain way so as not to entice the males to, like, was there any of that was going on for you? Like, where it was like, oh, wait, and then not only do I need to protect my purity, but also I need to make sure that I'm not, enticing or, causing the boys and men around me to be turned on, by the way that I'm acting or being.
Yeah, I actually remember much more of that than I remember protecting your own purity.
Interesting.
I remember, there was some discussion around protecting your own purity, but that was actually at least it certainly didn't rise to the fore in my mind. What I remember hearing a lot about was the importance of protecting men and boys from myself.
Wow.
And, really learning that men and boys were sexually weak, and that because of their, being visual and all of these things that you learn about the sexual inevitability, the inevitability of their sexuality, you were taught that because you don't have as strong of sexual needs and desires, which is part of the teaching, right? That it's your responsibility to ensure that the sexlessness of the community. So, what you wear, you better be really thoughtful about every item of clothing you put onto your body, because if you wear something that brings up a sexual thought or a feeling in a man and boy in your community, you are a sexual temptress. You are endangering him. You are endangering the community.
Wow.
Because of course, if he falls, and these are the leaders of our communities, then we all fall. So girls and women weren't only shamed for our own sexual thoughts and feelings, but we were shamed for the sexual thoughts and feelings of men and boys toward us in the community. And, so that heightened the anxiety, because this is yet another example of how your sexuality wasn't your own. Whether or not you were pure was determined by others. It had to do with whether they thought you were pure, whether they had sexual thoughts or feelings about you. And some of those things, are outside of, I would argue that all of those things are outside of your control, but some of those things are, entirely outside of your control. Like, for example, I was pulled aside and talked to about what I wore much more often than girls who weren't as curvy as I was, right? Because I was born with a particular body, I believe that that's one of the reasons that I was pulled aside, so much more often than some of my other friends. Some of my other friends were pulled aside and talked to about other things. For example, some of my friends who chose to desexualize themselves in order to function in the community.
Wow.
And wore really loose, baggy clothing all the time, and, performed their gender in more, stereotypically masculine ways. Those people were pulled aside and talked to about not being feminine enough and breaking the gender stereotype in a way that was also problematic, because, the purity teaching also teaches that you need to, be a stereotypical version of a girl or a woman.
Wow.
So we all got, we all had our own things, depending on what the community considered, the way in which we weren't just walking the tightrope just perfectly enough, So you lived in a constant state of anxiety at other people's perceptions.
Well, and just being a young woman and a young man and a young person in the world, that's enough, that carries enough anxiety with it. And then to add all these other layers on top of that, it's just like, you wonder why there's so much, OCD and depression and, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a result of trauma that, that you experience when you're at any stage in your life. But, many people experience trauma as children and then, are growing up into the world with PTSD, wondering what the hell's wrong with them, because it wasn't that bad, but the psychological stuff can be just as bad or worse than some of the physical trauma. So, and depending on the individual, trauma affects everyone differently. So
that's right.
We all have our own bandwidth for, what we've dealt with and how it's impacted us. So with regards to the book and this experience that you've had and connecting with other women that grew up in this community, how has the Me Too movement and, everything that's just come to light over the last few years impacted your journey?
Yeah. First I'll just say that even before the Me Too movement, before that tweet went viral and we started to use that terminology, I really was experiencing a Me Too movement of my own. It started when I talked to my girlfriends from back home in my community, which inspired me to actually go back to my hometown and spend a year interviewing all the girls I could get a hold of that year who are now, adults that I'd been raised with over a 10-year sort of span, people in their 20s who had been raised in the community as girls, and interviewing them and gathering and collecting their stories and sharing my own story with them. And then that became the catalyst for, another 11 years of interviews.
Wow.
This time with people around the country who were raised in communities like our own, again, documenting these stories of sexual shame and fear and anxiety that for many were manifesting in physical ways. And, that experience for me, I do talk about it as an interviewee sort of experience, which is true, but it also was something else. It also was really, I'm not a researcher. I am a fellow sufferer. and so in many ways, what we were doing was the story exchange. And, people would tell me a story, and if it felt useful. And, they were sharing the most common thing that I heard in interviews, which was, I feel like I'm the only one who's ever experienced this. I've never talked about this before, or I've hardly talked about this before because it's so shameful. I'm sure I'm the only one. If it felt appropriate, I would say, actually, let me tell you about someone else's story that's very similar to yours, or let me tell you about an aspect of my own story that's similar to yours. And so there was this Me Too thing happening among us in the interviews, and in many ways, that's how I healed. I put myself through 12 years of narrative therapy,
Wow.
telling my story over and over and over, and hearing my story told back to me in the stories of others with different details, but with the same core experiences. And so that has been a journey that I've been on and that we have been on. Many of my interviewees talk about it being the same for them, and a major part of their healing process was doing these interviews and having this space to tell their stories and to hear that they weren't alone. But what's happened culturally now, as more and more people are coming out of the woodwork and sharing stories that we had previously thought made us anomalies, made us broken, made us, whatever it was, that has only heightened it. So now I have people, some of my interviewees who are the most nervous to share their stories with me back in the early days, now will say things to me like, thank you for letting me be part of this movement, because it has started to feel, I think, increasingly like, less about, certainly for me, it feels less and less like it's about me every day and more and more like it's about us. But what's interesting is that to my interviewees, there's been a similar progression. People are moving from feeling like, oh, I'm telling my story, to I'm contributing my story to a larger tapestry of stories that we need to have told.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like it becomes an hour instead of an I.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I can imagine that connecting with these women, sharing your story and hearing their stories, knowing that you're not alone, and having that just be reinforced, like, oh, I am not alone in this.
Yeah.
That there are actually other people that I can, that can relate to me and I can relate to them, and we can support each other on this journey of reconciliation, right? Which to me is a very religious term, because growing up in the Roman Catholic Church, it's like, reconciliation, okay, go to confession, it's like this whole thing about that. And I'm using it in a new way, which is like reconciling the past and creating the new story of today as grown women in the world, making our own choices about who we are as sexual beings and what sexuality actually is and means to us, and then what we want to express and share with our children, with our daughters and sons, and our, the people in our community as they're growing into the world and into their adulthood.
Yes. Exactly.
So okay. So you started an organization called Break Free Together. Tell us a little bit about that.
I did. The reason I did that really was because I wanted to have some way to replicate the experience that happened during my interviews on a wider scale. So how could I provide others the same experience that my interviewees had and that I had of healing together? Because I've really come to believe that there's no way for us to break free from this alone. I think it really happens together. Maybe it's just with one other person, maybe it's with a larger community, but I think we can't really deconstruct this stuff in isolation. And so Break Free Together is a storytelling model, essentially, where we're looking to create opportunities for people to be able to release sexual shame and claim their whole selves, their mind and their spirit and their bodies as one entity. So we have different ways that people can do that. One is a dinner model that we work with churches and colleges and universities and nonprofits to bring this larger dinner experience to people. Another is a storytelling, sort of smaller scale storytelling model where we just encourage people to share their story. Maybe that's with a trusted friend or a sister, Definitely not somebody who is listening in order to try to fix you or save you, somebody who can really just listen. And, or maybe people are ready to be able to enter into a larger community conversation. So we have a hashtag, which is a Break Free Together hashtag that we're just putting out and encouraging people to use online so we can find one another. But some people, aren't ready to actually expose their names. They want to join the larger conversation, but they don't want their name tied to it. So I also, have a PO box where people can send postcards in where they tell their story, on the back of a postcard. And then I can take photographs of it and share it with Break Free Together hashtag so that people can join that conversation without having their personal profiles attached to it. You can sign the postcard, you can not, you can write your story, you can just draw a picture that, speaks to your story or write a single word. But, there needs to be some way that people come into community, I feel like, for this healing. That's something that I've really learned. So that's really what the work is all about.
I love that. Well, and it's like coming into community for this and in all areas, like coming into community as a world community, of human beings, like all of us coming into community. And the more that we recognize that we are not separate, that we are one, that we all have, no matter where you're born or what culture or religion or language you speak or whatever, there are experiences that all humans can relate to, right? And so this coming together, and this I see is one of those coming together experiences, which is so beautiful and so profound. I just really want to honor your courage to come out with this story. I can imagine that took a lot of courage for you, and that there may have been some backlash from the community. Did you experience anything like that?
Yeah, it has been a journey, to be sure. Every step of the way I've had to do soul work to get to the next step. And, my family in particular, my parents, really have been on that journey with me, which I'm very grateful that they've been on it with me. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't been a journey for them. They have struggled with this, particularly my mom, for a long time. I think she was very nervous. I know she was very nervous that my questioning the purity teachings that are such an important set of teachings in the evangelical community would cost me my salvation. And it's really, not until quite recently that she has come to, a real peace around what I'm doing and a real trust that this is actually God's work that I'm doing.
Wow.
And so, so she has been on a journey. But, to your point around, the universality and the sort of coming together as a larger culture, one of the things that I do want to point out is that, as I think, everyone knows, this is in no way exclusive to the evangelical community. And so Break Free Together is actually not targeting evangelicals and former evangelicals because it's so much bigger than that. The book talks about one very distinct population, but for us to be able to come together and heal, we are raised with these messages, in other Christianities and other religions, in secular culture. So really this is a much bigger conversation.
Absolutely. It absolutely is. And something else that just comes to me is just like, and this has been coming up a lot for me, is like recognize your own bias, and instead of judging, choose to relate. Like, how can actually, why is this bias coming up? Actually, is there something that is triggering in me? Like, is there something that I actually see here for me that I'm pushing away, and like what's triggering the bias, and just recognizing that bias and then choosing to say like, oh, here's an opportunity for me to connect with something instead of push it away.
So, that's really interesting. Yeah.
So, well, Linda, you are a star. It is so amazing to connect with you today. I want to make sure our community knows how to find you online, where they can find the book. So where can people connect with you and buy the book online?
Well, you can get the book anywhere, I think, that you like to buy books.
Okay.
So I will leave that to you. So it's called Pure, and the subtitle is Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women and How I Broke Free. And I also have a website, which is lindakayklein.com. And on that website, there's a Break Free Together page. So you can learn more about Break Free Together there.
Amazing. Okay. And so just so our audience knows, it'll all be in the show notes, including a couple of other links, but Linda Kay Klein, Linda K, K-A-Y, Klein, Klein.com. And the book is called Pure. Google it, check it out, buy it. Share your stories with Linda if you've got a story to share. And then also the Break Free Together, hashtag Break Free Together. Linda, what a great pleasure. Thank you again for doing this work. And I look forward to actually meeting you in the flesh sometime since we're both in New York City.
I look forward to that as well. That sounds wonderful.
Awesome. Well, congratulations. And we're just wishing you the best with this book launch and with everything else that you're creating and growing right now.
And to you as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, Ignite Intimacy community, you heard it here. Powerful conversation about sex, sexuality, shame, connecting with others, healing past trauma, and claiming our sexual identity as adults in the here and now and moving forward. I love you all. Thank you for joining us again. Please hop over to iTunes, leave us a rating and a review, and give us a shout. Let us know what impacted you about this conversation. You can reach us at hello@igniteintimacy.com. And in the meantime, stay blessed and ciao for now. Thanks for tuning in to another conversation on the Ignite Intimacy podcast hotline. We love that you choose to spend your time with us. Check us out at igniteintimacy.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes and leave us a review and a rating. It helps more people know about us. We love to hear from you. You can email us with questions, comments, or suggestions to hello@igniteintimacy.com. And tell your friends. Music was arranged by Jason Pfaff and Mike Corey, and this podcast is produced by yours truly, Laura Aisha. Thanks again, and we'll see you on the next one. In the meantime, let your light shine bright and ignite your intimacy.